So welcome everyone to the first of our great debates on politics and economics, where we in the School of Politics and Economics and others debate the big issues of our time using our studies of political economy, politics and economics as guides. My name is Peter John. I am head of the School of Politics and Economics, so the site of our great debates. And our first debate is going to be on one of the key issues of our age, which is the climate emergency we face, and which is affecting us all and is going to affect us all, and even more. And I hope many of our students are here today because I'm sure you are thinking about the future like we all are. And I think the idea is that with a lot of the scientific findings secure and even many policy options understood, the forum of a great debate can explore why the politics and economics has not delivered the necessary change, which is really about the whole political economy of it all. And the idea is we're going to look into these issues of politics, economics, political economy to see what we can do in terms of ideas to help us solve or mitigate this problem. And we're going to ask whether we actually need a new form of political economy to help us understand it. So we have our event today, and obviously the normal features of these kind of events apply. Please do keep your mics on mute to prevent echoing. We will be recording these great debates, so your consent is implied in that. And we also have a plan for today, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at the plan for today, where we're starting with this keynote session. And then at the end of it, you get a chance to choose to go into a number of working groups with our facilitators to help you debate. So do have a look at the titles of these groups and then decide which one you wish to go into. So you're going to get then an hour or so to debate, and then we all come back at 4 p.m. to report back, where we're going to have our Dean, Franz Berkhout, and Professor Sarah Birch to help us respond and sum up. So we're very much looking forward to today, and let me introduce our distinguished panel. First, Professor Rebecca Willis, who is Professor of Practice at the University of Lancaster and researches on the environment and sustainability policy, and is author of a recently published book, Too Hot to Handle: The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change. To follow, we have Professor Neil Carter, who's based at the University of York, and one of his books is called The Politics of the Environment, recently issued into a third edition. And finally, we have Sam Fankhauser, who is director. Actually, I think, Frankie, you're switching today, actually. He is currently director of the Grantham Research Institute across the road, if we were here, at the London School of Economics. But I believe as of today, he joins the University of Oxford, its Net Zero Initiative. And he was a member of the UK Committee on Climate Change and is author of a book called Sustainability Economics. So we have a great lineup of speakers. Each is going to speak for 12 minutes. There's a Q&A session at the end. Please do drop your questions into the chat, and I will try and pick out as many as I can at the end. So, Becky, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, and I'm so pleased to be here. And the great debates sound amazing, and I'm pleased that you're starting with, literally the most fundamental issue, I think. So I'm gonna talk about, in very broad terms, about democracy and climate change. And I'm gonna start with two seemingly contradictory and contrasting situations. Let me call them Exhibit 1 and Exhibit 2. So Exhibit 1 is an event that some of you may remember from last November, when over 70 million people in one of the world's oldest and most celebrated democracies voted for a candidate who has time and again denied the science of climate change. So he didn't win the White House, but still 74, I think 74 million is a big number. And amongst those 74 million, of course, there will have been some who agreed with him about the science, but most or some or most might not have agreed with him about the science, but they didn't let it influence their vote. They had other priorities, essentially. And you know, if you've come along to this great debate about climate change and you want to consider the politics and the economics of this sort of evidence, what we saw in November last year, could absolutely fill you with despair. And it could also possibly lead you to the sort of conclusion that James Lovelock reached over a decade ago, that, and he said this explicitly, we need to put democracy on hold to tackle the climate crisis, that it's a situation as serious as war. And so we shouldn't let the people have a say, we should just get on with it. And this call for experts taking over is actually one that I, as someone who operates sort of within the climate policy community, one that I hear surprisingly often. And it's not normally articulated as explicitly as James Lovelock, but there's a strong sense that those with the knowledge and the evidence should take control. This is what the social scientist Martin Hager calls cockpitism. That's cockpit, like an airline cockpit, and cockpitism. And it's the illusion that you can steer the planet the way that you fly a plane. So you put your faith in the pilots, and those pilots have all the information they need, and they have a dashboard of gleaming instruments and levers, and they can steer us on the right flight path. So quite aside from whether we should be using aviation metaphors, I think this illusion of cockpitism is really dangerous. You know, not least because you can't steer the planet like you can steer a plane, the science is too complicated, but actually more importantly, it raises more questions than it answers in terms of, you know, who are those pilots? What gives them the authority to fly the plane? What about the rest of us stuck back in the cabin? Are we, you know, do we have any input into this flight or not? And the other big problem with cockpitism is that it leads to strategies of what I've come to think of as climate policy by stealth, which is where there are attempts to try and reduce emissions, trying to tackle climate change in ways that you hope that people don't notice. And I think that's largely how we've tackled climate change so far. Our biggest successes have been decarbonisation of the power sector and decarbonisation of certain parts of industry and efficiency gains. So essentially they're things that can sort of tick along in the background without people noticing. But if we look at the challenges ahead in terms of sustainable transport, in terms of the challenges around food and farming and diet, home heating, I could go on. They are all things that people are going to notice. You can't do that by stealth. So that's Exhibit 1, Trump in the White House, or 70 million people voting for Trump to be in the White House. And that brings me to Exhibit 2. Exhibit 2 is also from last year, 2020, and it is an absolutely incredible experiment that I was involved in called Climate Assembly UK. It was a Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change, commissioned by 6 select committees in Parliament. And just over 100 citizens were selected to be representative of the UK as a whole in terms of age, demographics, ethnicity, whereabouts in the UK they came from, and crucially, their attitudes to climate change, how concerned they were about climate change. And over the course of 4 weekends, they had the chance to learn from experts and witnesses about climate science and climate action. They deliberated with each other and with those experts, and they developed a set of recommendations. And this this is the set of recommendations. It is a big fat book, old telephone directory style. You would be pleased to know I'm not going to go through it. But if you look at that report that the citizens came up with, it's basically a coherent, sensible, and ambitious agenda for how the UK should meet it. So you don't see, a huge amount of opposition to the issue. You actually see people sort of rolling their sleeves up and getting on with the challenge at hand. So what are we to make of these two seemingly contradictory pieces of evidence? Can we trust people or not? Can we put our faith in democracy or not? And you might now think that the differences between these two cases are about the different politics of the US and the UK. And, that's true to a certain extent. In the UK, there's been a remarkable consensus, at least on the aims, on the targets around climate. And that's held for more than a decade. And I think Neil's going to talk more about that. And in the US, climate has become a polarized issue. It's become part of a wider cultural divide. Democrats wear masks, want tighter gun laws, want climate action, and Republicans are broadly lockdown skeptics, want the right to bear arms, don't want climate action. I mean, that's a caricature, but there are those clear divides. There's actually some fascinating research with Republican politicians to suggest they're more concerned about climate than they let on, but they don't think it will help their electoral chances to talk out, to be loud about that. But I think there's something deeper going on here, actually. It's not just US politics, because a very similar thing has happened just up the road from me in Cumbria with this fuss that you've probably heard of about whether local planners should consent a new coal mine. And, I was speaking to a local reporter yesterday from the Whitehaven Star, and he said to me that he was having really different discussions with people. Essentially, locally, people want the coal mine despite the climate implications because they want the 500 jobs that it brings. And he said that the discussions he has with, essentially the climate community nationally, and actually with the national politicians, is very different from the local debates with local people and with local politicians. So I think those 70 odd million votes for Trump and local support for the coal mine slightly counterintuitively tell me that we need more democracy and better democracy rather than, as Lovelock suggests, bypassing it. It's not just Climate Assembly UK. The experience of similar deliberative processes in France, in Ireland, and in local areas, and yes, even some in the US, support the idea that if people are given the respect, the responsibility, the access to information and evidence, they would support the action that we need to tackle the climate emergency. Because what it comes down to fundamentally is that no one, or maybe I should say vanishingly few people, would purposefully vote for a 3-degree warming or the destruction of the natural world. No one's actually actively choosing that option, but we've got ourselves into this really difficult situation. It's a sort of silent standoff where, on the one hand, citizens are concerned and want action, and that's shown by polling data, but they're discouraged by the silence or inaction of politicians, either leading to cynicism or a kind of confusion, a sort of contradictory sense of, can't be that much of a problem if politicians aren't speaking out. So that's on the citizens' side. And on the other side, politicians know they need to act more decisively, but they don't have enough understanding of citizen support to do this. So I've taken to thinking of this, and this will be very familiar, obviously, to politics students. I've taken to thinking of this in terms of a breakdown in the social contract between citizens and state around climate. We've reached an impasse, effectively.
Thank you so much, Becky. That was absolutely fantastic. And we're certainly going to rise to your challenge about the nature of the question about new political economy. and I'm sure the how question is going to feature very strongly in our debates later. So thank you very much indeed. Just remind people that if you want to put questions, pop them in the chat. I'll try and collect some up with hands later, but I think chat might be the easiest way to get your question in later on for the Q&A session. So thank you again, Becky. Now introduce Neil Carter for the second keynote speech. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you. Can you see my slide?
I can indeed.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about the party politics of climate change in the UK. And, oops, sorry, there we go. So I think you can broadly characterize climate politics for much of the last 25 years as characterized by passive consensus. In other words, all the parties, but particularly Labour and the Conservatives, have increasingly accepted the science of climate change, the need for action, the need to strengthen their own party programmes, and when in government, to introduce measures that address climate change, to try and mitigate climate change at least. But overall, progress has been incremental. The ambition has been broadly limited. It's got tough, it's got better, and more of that in a moment, but we can characterise it as being relatively limited, certainly for the first sort of 10, 15 years of that period. The one exception is this period, which I call a competitive consensus, between sort of late 2006 and 2010, when we saw some really really radical, a step change in climate policy, headlined, of course, by the Climate Change Act of 2008, and a whole tranche of policy measures associated with that, lots of spending, lots of new initiatives, a low carbon transition plan, and so on. And what characterized that period was the fact that for a brief few years, all the parties were competing with each other to try and be greener than each other, to actually be more ambitious than each other on climate change. So in other words, party competition on climate change really ramped up. And so, if you like, lesson one for this broader debate, I think action, certainly in the UK, action is far more likely to occur when you've got this kind of consensus about the need for action and genuine party competition over climate change. And what you don't want is what you see in other parts of the world, polarization. Polarization is bad for climate politics, for progressive climate policy. We see it in America, we've seen it in Australia. And actually we saw it we saw elements of it in this country sort of midway through the coalition government to around, well, I suppose until Theresa May's sort of disastrous 2017 general election. And in this period we saw, although there was the leadership was broadly committed still, there was consensus across the political leaders. Within the Conservative Party, particularly on the backbenches, there was growing concern, particularly about onshore wind, about the size of green levies on domestic and business energy bills. And this was sort of ramped up by the competition from the right, from UKIP, which was very strongly climate sceptic, indeed wanted to tear up the Climate Change Act, and by the right-wing press at this time. And we got to the point where the headline, we got it's often known in civil service circles, I understand, as the green crap era. This is when David Cameron, having embraced climate change early on in his leadership in opposition of the Conservative Party, got to the point where it said, in an almost kind of Thomas a Becket-like way, can someone rid me of this green crap? And I think that's dissipated in recent years, but it's still there. And to tie back to what Becky just mentioned, the Cumbrian coal mine. Well, there, Mark Jenkinson, the Workington MP, Conservative MP from that area, in response to the decision to put the decision into review, said that ministers have bowed to the climate terrorists. So that language is there's still elements of it around. But to jump back to some lessons then from the competitive consensus, having decided we don't want polarization, that's bad for climate politics. What characterized that period of competitive consensus? Well, number one, there was a good old-fashioned traditional environmental NGO campaign, Friends of the Earth, the Big Ask campaign, calling for the climate change bill, which then became the Climate Change Act. And that was a very traditional campaign. It was about lobbying MPs, about getting action. It was writing postcards and organising events. It was very conventional, but it demonstrates the importance of environmental NGOs and the role of that green lobby. Business, by this time, having previously been very obstructive to many climate measures, was increasingly on side. Business bought the science, and increasingly, particularly linked to the, the Stern review, bought the economic argument as well. Business then and now want targets, they want certainty, they want a stable investment climate so they can invest in green technologies. And importantly this time, of course, we were members of the EU, which meant that business didn't feel that, if they were investing in green technologies, they weren't going to have a competitive hit and be outdone by sort of businesses across Europe. They knew that at least businesses within Europe were on side. Always important not to forget the role of individuals. There was a clear Cameron effect. Once Cameron became the leader of the Conservative Party at the end of 2005, embraced the environment as his signature issue to detoxify and modernise the Tory party, that put pressure on Labour ministers, but pressure in a kind of positive way. Suddenly they realised, oh, we can take measures we wouldn't have dreamt of before because we're not going to get trashed by the opposition in the same way. And here, in particular, the Miliband's. First of all, David Defra, and then Foreign Secretary, and then later Ed Miliband as the first secretary of the now defunct Department of Energy and Climate Change. They brought in important initiatives during this period. And the UK is part of a wider EU climate leadership, where the EU is trying to lead on global climate diplomacy and has introduced a set of policies to help deliver that. And certainly in particular, the renewable energy targets have been a really important catalyst for the kind of rapid growth of the renewable energy sector over the last decade in the UK. So a range of important characteristics that groups might want to pick up features of that competitive consensus. And then we saw in the election at the end of 2019, signs perhaps that we're seeing a new competitive consensus. The manifestos were all, I mean, of course, 2019 was the year of climate. Greta Thunberg, the climate strikes, the emergence of Extinction Rebellion and so on. And the manifestos were packed with substantive policies. If you just go back to 2017, I don't think any party, including the Greens, had a zero carbon target. In 2019, all the major parties did. The opposition parties all embraced different versions of a Green New Deal, the idea of creating jobs and a just transition, and there are energy efficiency policies and renewable energy targets, massive tree planting programs. They all agreed on the need to roll out an EV, electric vehicle infrastructure, and so on. So positive signs, but equally still, as Becky flagged up, these tensions. Both Labour and the Conservative were both minded to build a third runway at Heathrow. The Tories promised massive road building programme. And so sort of my final substantive slide is, can an old red wall save the planet? I think much of the politics of the next few years is going to be around, can the Conservatives hold on to these former red wall seats, which are now blue? And I think one tension, and I think Becky touched on this as well, talking about America. If you look at sort of traditional left-right, public opinion surveys in the UK show that there isn't a really sharp left-right division on climate policy, but there is quite a sharp Galtan, or if you like, authoritarian libertarian dimension. So green, alternative, libertarian remainers are all in favour of action on climate change. Traditional authoritarian nationalist Brexit voters are less so. And of course, they're the ones who live in those red wall seats. So I think Boris actually, despite his history on climate change, is increasingly buying into the agenda, but he sees it very much, as we all know with Boris, he loves infrastructure spending. Does throwing huge amounts of infrastructure, which I think is really important for things like EV infrastructure, for things like, as we've seen recently, the announcement of new factories in Redcar and on the Humber to build wind turbines and so on, that's important? Is it enough? Does this government have a clear strategy for creating, essentially transforming the economy from a fossil fuel-based economy, which of course characterises all those red wall seats, to an economy based on new, green, cleaner technologies and low carbon technologies and so on? That seems to me the important question. So far, we've seen some indications. Unfortunately, the government's 10-point net zero recovery plan is perhaps less than as ambitious as it might be. Certainly there's only about 3 billion of new spending, where they're going to spend, what, 100 billion on high-speed rail, and they spent 67 billion on a disastrous test and trace program. And they're still talking about spending 27 billion on roads, expanding Leeds Bradford Airport, the Cumbrian coal mine, only this week, cutting air passenger duties, and so on. So we still don't have that joined up, integrated thinking. And there's a danger that if the government pursues that Singaporean low regulation, low tax model, that even if they don't dismantle, I'm sure they won't dismantle climate policies, but there may be some reining in of important environmental regulations. But just to end on a more positive note, Glasgow, COP26 later this year, there is evidence that where there are, these big international jamborees take place, that there is a positive summatory effect. The hosts of these summits want things to happen. They want it to succeed. And sort of under the radar a little bit, Boris Johnson just before Christmas did commit that our nationally determined contribution for the next stage of the Paris Agreement would be a 68% cut in emissions by 2030 on our 1990 emissions. Now that's pretty ambitious, and we're not yet on target to meet it. But it does suggest that if the government wants to make sure that it backs up its commitments to Glasgow and makes it a success, that we are going to see some radical policies. And I think what we want to see is not just joined up thinking across the piece, but also a joined up thinking as, this could be the way the Conservatives win and hold on to those red wall seats. But I think equally, that's going to be a site of interesting politics anyway over the next 2 or 3 years. Finally, 2 or 3 questions to think about in a couple of the groups. The radical politics group might debate this. Well, what kind of radical politics do we want? Is it that traditional Friends of the Earth type campaign that was so successful in getting Climate Change Act? Or do we want more of the Extinction Rebellion, direct action, working outside the system? When it comes to the policy choices group, how do we persuade any government to prioritise sort of long-term diffuse climate change mitigation policies when facing short-term economic trade-offs like building Cumbrian coal mines or digging Cumbrian coal mines and so on? And that COVID-19 group, does the COVID state intervention we've seen, all that state intervention on COVID over the last 12 months, does that show that, well, if you can do it for COVID, surely we can do it for climate change? Or does it just mean we've used up all the money and all the goodwill? Hopefully not. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Excellent stuff. And you are rising to Becky's challenge about some of the kind of practical issues and kind of how to get there, looking at sort of current framework of British politics. And you've also given us some ideas for the working groups, again, planting those ideas in the audience about which group you want to join, which one tickles your fancy, as it were. And now we move to our final speaker for today, Sam Fankhauser. And Frank is going to talk more about some of the international issues related to the climate emergency debate. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Peter, and good to be across the road, as it were, at our neighbouring university. As you said, Peter, I'm going to talk about more the international picture, but also probably a bit more economics and less political economy, although I will try to sort of speak to the politics of things a little bit as well. My starting point is this picture here, which puts the UK Climate Change Act, which Neil talked about and Becky mentioned, into the global context. The Climate Change Act is an example of a framework, strategic framework law on climate change, of which there are now probably sort of 140 or thereabouts. So 2/3 of all nations have some sort of framework regulation, framework law on climate change. They're not all as sophisticated as the Climate Change Act. They're not all passed by Parliament. Some of them are executive orders. But a lot of countries start to have that sort of framework approach to climate change. I've given you here a few examples of the company that the Climate Change Act keeps. Let me just highlight a few of them. I'm not going to go through all of them. The Korean framework law is interesting because it's a law that is actually about green growth, not about climate change. So it combines environmental policy with industrial policy, and quite successfully so. A bit further down the list, Mexico, the Mexican general law on climate change is actually quite carbon copy is probably not the right word for a number of reasons, but inspired by the UK Climate Change Act. And then we have further down the French energy transition law. The Chinese is an interesting case because the climate policy in China happened through the 5-year plans rather than bespoke legislation. But there's a lot of climate ambition in the climate change, or on climate change in the 5-year plans of China. And then a few more examples. New Zealand, Sweden are interesting because those are amongst the first laws, besides the UK, that had an explicit net zero target enshrined in law. And just to show that this isn't a sort of an OECD story, there's the Kenyan Climate Change Act as well. So those are the framework laws, and they're part of a bigger landscape of about 2,000 or so laws that are relevant to climate change. And the picture you see here comes from a database we have at LSE called Climate Change Laws of the World, which has those 2,000 things in it. Quite broad. Some is energy efficiency, some is renewable energy, and you see which countries have how many of those laws. So there's quite an intensive sort of lawmaking going on climate change. So that's, I guess, the good news. The question then is, what have those laws achieved? How much have emissions come down as a consequence of those laws? The problem, of course, is we can't observe the counterfactual. We don't know what emissions would have been if there hadn't been any laws. But that's what we tried to do. We ran some statistics over those 2,000 laws, actually it was a subset of them, and we tried to calculate that counterfactual. We tried to ask what had each one statistically on average, what do each one of those laws contribute to emission reductions? And by implication, so what would the world without any of those laws have looked like? And the answer is, it makes a substantial difference. It's better than a kick in the teeth, as my mother-in-law would say, but it doesn't add up to climate protection. The numbers you see here on that chart, emissions in 1999, about 20, that's CO2, about 23 gigatons. In 2016, that has gone up to just under 33 gigatons. So that increase in about 10 gigatons, how did that come about? If it hadn't been for climate change legislation, we would have had an increase of just under 16 gigatons. But the climate laws that we have, those 2,000, they reduced that increase by about sort of a third, by about 5.8 gigatons. So climate laws have made a dent. They have sort of significantly bent the growth curve on emissions. 5.8 gigatons is about the annual US CO2 emissions. So climate laws make a difference, but again, it doesn't add up to climate protection. Now the question then is, how do we make those laws more effective? And why is the reason that the laws that we have are not more effective? And the good news here is that we are starting to understand, I suppose that's what Becky would call cockpitism, but sort of the technocrats start to understand how good climate policy looks like, the sort of measures that we would have to introduce, the challenges that we in the sort of in the realpolitik in which we live, they're pretty hard to actually implement. And the sort of generic measures of what I would say a good climate change law, or a good suite of climate change policy should include is the sort of the three levers that you see here on this slide. First and foremost, I suppose we have to address the climate change externality in economic speak, the fact that emitting CO2, emitting greenhouse gases causes environmental, societal, economic harm, and that harm isn't reflected in what when you make your decision. So the polluter doesn't pay. So first set of policies has to do with internalizing the climate externality. That leads us to carbon pricing. We all know that carbon pricing exists in the world, in the UK, in Europe, but carbon prices we see are too low for serious climate action. They're too patchy. Not enough of the emissions that we need to reduce are actually covered by the carbon price. And that's the sort of, a lot of that is political economy constraints. People don't like taxes. They react very aversely to the idea that there would be a higher price on carbon emissions, even though, it makes the polluters pay. So from environmental sort of first principles, making the polluter pay is a good thing. But if you happen to be that polluter and the thing is called a tax, then people tend to switch off. So that's instrument number one. We need to put the price on carbon to internalize the externality, clear political economy constraints in doing that. The second suite of measures, and that's where some economists will start deviating, but most of them would say that just putting a price on carbon isn't enough. You need a second suite of measures that makes people more responsive to the price signal, that overcomes some of the other market and policy barriers that make the whole system being a bit too rigid. And those other barriers have to do with clean innovation. We know that innovation has societal benefits. We know that the market underprovides innovation. That's particularly true for clean innovation. So we need policies to deal with that. And we have lots of examples of that. Most of them are downstream. They're sort of policies that deal with, demand pull, so subsidies for renewable energy. Some of them are upstream on R&D subsidies and support and so on. We have a whole suite of issues related to stickiness on energy efficiency and energy efficiency barriers, where people actually have experimented trying to find the right policy mix since the 1970s and the first oil price crisis, but we still don't fully know how one gets energy efficiency to be a sort of a less rigid system. Some barriers to green finance and the way the financial sector behaves. So this second suite of measures is actually a lot easier in political economy terms. It's not easy, but it's easier because it often involves subsidies, it often involves state support. So those are easier to get past parliaments, but they're not easy. Getting people to change their behavior isn't straightforward. The third set of policies that we need in this sort of cockpitism ideal policy mix is we have to deal with the unintended consequences of the policies that I've just talked about. And those unintended consequences have to do with things like competitiveness. There's a worry that if my carbon policies are too stringent and the costs on my industry are too high, emissions and jobs and economic activity will disappear abroad. And there's obviously the sort of Cambrian coal mine issue of jobs and a just transition. How do we help workers in a high carbon industry, high carbon jobs? How do we help those people transition into the zero carbon economy, where there are lots of jobs, actually, quite attractive jobs, some of them, but the transition, the reskilling can be quite hard and quite traumatic. We all, or most of you will have read or even remember what happened when Thatcher tried to close the coal industry. It was hugely damaging to those communities. So that's an example of just how socially and economically difficult those transitions can be, and we need policies to deal with those. And that, as you can tell, that's where the political economy really sticks in terms of the competitiveness, in terms of facilitating the job migration to zero carbon jobs. So that's the story of national government policy. Let me just very quickly tell you that obviously national government policy isn't everything. We have to look at the entire ecosystem or political system where climate action happens. These are some of the areas where this is the case. Becky talked about the climate assembly. This is an example of a lot of action that is happening at the local community level. Local communities, the grassroots, it's a lot of climate action, a lot of interest going on, occasionally clashing, as we've seen in West Cumbria, with the jobs agenda. You all know about the school strikes and the civil society agenda. You probably know about the courts. Increasingly, we see courts and judges playing a role in climate action. And there's some 400 court cases related to climate change. The probably highest profile one is the picture you have here, which is a Dutch NGO, which took the Dutch government to court and won against everybody's expectation one, and sort of forcing the Dutch government on human rights ground, I believe it was, to change its carbon policies. So judges increasingly can help with the climate change agenda. I'm running a little bit out of time, so if you want to know what the bishop did at the stock exchange, you have to ask me a question and I can tell you about that. Let me finish with a couple of questions or suggestions for questions for further discussion in your breakout groups. One is what I sort of tried to hint at, the first one, the public acceptability of carbon policies. If we do know theoretically what the good policy looks like, how can we make those policies publicly acceptable? How can we make them fair? How can we get them implemented? The second question that you may or may not want to talk about is about context. What I described to you is pretty much a sort of a rich country's agenda of how one deals with carbon policy. How do those recommendations travel to different socioeconomic contexts? Do we have the same story about carbon prices in middle-income countries, where there's probably or low-income countries, where there's a smaller tax base, where there's more fuel poverty? Can we sort of figure out how those recommendations travel in different socioeconomic contexts? Third question, the delivery. Going back to that observation that we have lots of climate change laws. The UK has beautiful climate targets, as Neil described, but there's a disconnect between the targets and the action. And the question is, how does one move from good intention to action? That might be a third question we want to talk about. And finally, the context in which a lot of these things will have to happen over the next 2, 3, 4 years is the COVID recovery. I hope it will be the recovery. And how do you marry that sort of economic recovery agenda from COVID with the zero carbon agenda, the catchword being build back better? How on earth do you actually do that? So some suggestions on questions, but let me stop here for some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was fascinating, and in a sense, in terms of setting this thing up, we are sense we're speaking from politics to political economy to economics and reading across. And Sam sets out some really interesting political economy kind of constraints and opportunities that we face. So thank you all three speakers. Fascinating stuff. We've got a bit of time for Q&A, and I'll pick a few out, and maybe if the questioner would like to ask the question by unmuting and speaking. So I thought I'd go first to Sanchin, which goes straight to this issue which Becky raises of, and comes up and Sam's talk about sort of democracy versus the more technocratic cockpit sort of way of approaching things. So Sanchin, do you want to pose your question to everyone?
Sure, thank you. That was a great talk by everyone, so thank you for that. I think the question is mostly to Becky, and I'm not a student of politics, as I said in the chat. I do environmental econ, but work on nudge theory and nudge plus in particular. So I think if we were to sort of rely on societies to make these rules for us and to sort of guide us, often we see in a democracy that there are too many voices, and that can fail. I come from India, and we're the largest democracy, and I see democracy failing a lot of times. So does that mean that some strict sort of top-down governance is required? Even though we have this sort of collective voices, we need some expert out there who's paternalistic and sort of says, okay, let's pick this and let's go with this. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
So Becky, do you want to reply?
Yeah, sure. I'm mostly desperate to know what nudge plus is compared to nudge, but I will ask Professor Google after this after this talk. But it's a really good challenge you pose, and so what I think is, so what I'm arguing for in terms of greater citizen involvement is not at all to say that political leadership isn't needed, that we should just wait for some kind of bottom-up, sort of spontaneous civil society takeover. I absolutely think that it is the job of politicians to show leadership and to to set firstly to speak out about the climate crisis, to say that they're worried about it. And I mean, in this country, Boris Johnson is kind of happy to do the climate shtick, but he's not really having that conversation about what it means for people's lives, either the potential impacts of climate change, or painting a picture of what an ambitious climate strategy looks like and feels like to people. So I really think it's up to politicians to show that leadership. But then also the sort of slightly counterintuitive thing is that if it always reminds me of parenting, this, but if you do set really clear boundaries and say, right, this is the direction we're heading, you then open up a much richer and broader social conversation about how we achieve those targets. So, and I don't, Sam, despite what you were saying, I don't at all disapprove of you setting out the kind of general frameworks that we need to adhere to. But I would say that within each one of those sort of bars that you laid out, there's plenty of room for a kind of a social debate, a civil society debate about how we do a just transition, for example, about how we change the financial incentives that run our economy. So I would say it's kind of, it is a both and, that we need to be much better at getting citizen views and dialogue into all aspects of that economy. But it's absolutely down to politicians to lead. And I want to I mean, a couple of examples of where I think I've seen this political leadership. I think actually we are seeing it in Joe Biden from early progress. I think he's surprised a lot of people on that. Also actually leadership, a very parochial example maybe, but leadership from the Welsh government around sort of what they're saying about the need to consider future generations, and the way that they've opened up their policy making process through their Future Generations Act is another example. So you see it as well in cities leading the way. So we can see this, but it's not the norm at the moment.
Thank you, Becky. And maybe hand this over to the other speakers. Maybe Neil, you sounded quite pessimistic about some of the democratic voices, and in actual fact, maybe a little bit pointing to more sort of government intervention side, given failure parties and the like. And Sam, do you want to pick up the issue of the cockpit and where you stand on some of these sort of top-down kind of choices? So Neil, do you want to come in?
Well, I think in a sense, it's, as Becky said, it's a combination of the two. You can't, you need government in a way we too often haven't had in this country over the last 20, 30 years. You need government to have a clear strategy. You need government to plan. You need it to take, certainly on the, those big picture sort of things, like, as we've seen already, actually, government's played a key role in bringing about the shift to renewable energy. And I think we need, it's got to play a key role in leading, working with manufacturers, working with local councils. It's got on the EV infrastructure. For me, the huge challenge of changing our homes, how are you going to persuade half the population that we can no longer have gas in our home? That seems to me is one of the real big sort of challenges which affects all of our lifestyles in a huge way. And government's got to play a role in that. But equally, it can't be government coming in, as Becky says, and just in every sense saying this is how you're going to do it. It's got to be, you've got to win people over. You've got to get people to embrace these change in their lifestyles and find ways in which that are going to prove acceptable to people. So I think, yeah, it's not an either or, is it? It's got to be some combination of the two. That's not very profound, but I think that's got to be the way.
Thank you, Neil. Sam, do you want to come in?
Yeah, same thing. The two processes have to really reinforce each other, the sort of the politics or the government and the grassroots. They can either reinforce themselves in a good way or in a bad way, but it is that sort of cycle that they have. So what I mean by that is the fact that there was net zero in every manifesto at the last election. That had a lot to do with what happened at the beginning of that year with Extinction Rebellion and school strikes and so on. It wasn't that politicians had that idea out in a vacuum. So that's an example of how democracy actually reinforcing politics. And then the political measures that we have, they probably have to be sort of adjusted to be politically palatable. So carbon tax is the policy I think most about occasionally. We just have to move away from the textbook policy of a carbon tax to more sort of politically acceptable structures, these hypothecation, recycling of revenues, and so on. And then you can create those self-reinforcing cycles.
Thank you, Sam. I'll take another question from Leo. You've got a question about the relative role of rich and poor countries. Leo, do you want to pose your question, or would you like me to pose it for you? Leo?
Hi. Thank you. Yes, just my question was, I feel like climate change is often regarded as a rich country problem, in the sense that rich countries have the intelligence and the money as well to care about climate change, whereas in poor countries, they're dealing with war, with lack of economic development, poverty, etc. So my question is, can poor countries really push forward an agenda for environmental protection when they're dealing with the issues I've mentioned? Thank you.
Okay, perhaps and perhaps maybe we're getting towards the end now, so maybe we'll do a tour of the speakers, and the speakers want to pull anything else out of the question chat, something they want to mention, and then we'll have a quick go around. So maybe just a minute and a half or a minute for each speaker. So Sam, do you want to come in first on the rich poor question?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and obviously a very salient one. The first thing to say is that net zero reduces the hiding space for everybody. If you only want to reduce your emissions by 80%, that means somebody can have the 20%, but net zero means everybody has to do something. Obviously, there's a bit of remaining carbon space, and if it was me, I would probably allocate that remaining carbon space in the atmosphere to poor countries. The reality is that there's going to be competition for it. So poor countries will have to act as well, because what they wish to emit is more than what the carbon space is that we have available. The good news, I would say, is that we should stop thinking of climate change as an issue of burden sharing and cost and, who has to wear the hair shirt. It's increasingly becoming a story of opportunity and growth as well. There are lots of jobs, lots of growth opportunities in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, and so on. And that then creates opportunities for everybody, rich and poor. You don't want to be a sort of a high carbon island in a low carbon world. That would be economically damaging as well. So there's the risk, actually, if you don't switch to low carbon early enough, you're going to be left behind, and you don't want that either.
Thank you. Neil, do you want to pick up with some of these points? Anything else?
Yeah, sorry. I think Sam made some really good points there, and I would endorse them. It seems to me there's so many opportunities for it. We need to kind of not think of it in an either or, trade-off thing. And it seems to me there's loads of scope, and it's such a shame that this is a time when we're cutting. The UK is cutting its sort of overseas aid budget. It just seems to me there's so much scope through overseas aid, through a whole range of through all these potential post-Brexit. I'm thinking UK perspective here a little bit, but through any trade agreements and so on, for the UK to play such a crucial lead role, develop using its own soft power as well, to actually play a key role in helping many countries in the global south to move in this direction. And yeah, it just seems to me that there are so many opportunities. And I just think, to tie up to the COVID theme, I think there again, what we're going to see over the next, what we're seeing at the moment when we turn on the news is these kind of challenges over kind of, are we going to get COVID nationalism? So it seems to me this climate change is a way to kind of break out of these kind of nationalistic agendas which could occur and could arise out of COVID. And it seems to me there's so many sort of wider soft power benefits that could be could be kind of accrued for countries like the UK and other sort of European, North American countries to benefit from. It's a little bit waffly, sorry, but go on.
Thank you, Neil. Not waffly at all. And Becky, you get the last word to maybe deal the rich poor point. Thank you.
I'll try and live up to that. On the international question, yeah, I mean, I think that's been covered, but I mean, I think maybe there's too much emphasis placed on the fact that, you know, developed nations are the ones who are somehow leading the way. I mean, it's worth remembering that, you know, in developed countries, our footprints are vastly more than other countries, obviously. And there are countries now, and unfortunately increasingly will be so, where climate politics is front and center because of the impact. So, you know, the Philippines with typhoons, obviously Bangladesh, the small island states, you know, this is not some kind of, you know, future issue. This is here and now. So, you know, actually, I think we can learn from that. We can see what climate politics is, you know, is going to look like when the impacts hit. And so I think that there's, you know, there is a moral imperative on those countries that industrialized first, both to lead the way, which is why the coal mine this year is so damaging, right? And also to look at, and I know it's a big argument in the run up to the Glasgow summit, to look at climate finance and particularly loss and damage, which is the kind of catch-all term for how we compensate countries that are on the front line of climate impacts. I just wanted to pick up a couple of other questions. I thought they were really good. Mehmet's one on environmental harmful technologies like Bitcoin. Yeah, I mean, the real danger is environmentally harmful and border hating, if you can put it that way, technologies, ones that cannot be easily controlled by the nation state. And I don't have an easy answer to those. In some ways we need, you know, climate action is one that's best tackled at a global and local level, and yet still the nation state is the primary source of politics and lawmaking. So I think, you know, that it's just a challenge. I can't say much more about it than that. And then bonus point on the new policing bill. Yeah, I mean, I think if the government has Extinction Rebellion in its sights, and I think that's really problematic. And the idea that that the amount of noise that you that you emit as a protester should be, you know, what means you get arrested or not, I think is deeply problematic. So I think we absolutely need a really vibrant civil society, which includes protest, to be able to get this right.